8 o'clock in the morning, August the 9th, in the year 378. On the Thracian plain, roughly 13 kilometers north of the city of Adrianople, the field army of the Eastern Roman Empire is marching under a sun that will not break until evening. There is no water along the route. The men have not eaten. The column has been moving since before dawn, and it will keep moving for close to 8 hours, in iron helmets and mail, through burning stubble fields, toward an enemy their emperor believes he has already counted. At the head of that column rides Valens, emperor of the East for 14 years. His scouts have reported perhaps 10,000 Gothic warriors camped ahead, drawn up behind a great circle of wagons. Valens has more men than that. He also has a nephew, the Western Emperor Gratian, marching to join him with a second army, and he has decided not to wait for him. A victory shared, in the arithmetic of Roman politics, is a victory halved. By sunset, the Eastern Field Army will effectively cease to exist, perhaps 2/3 of it dead, and the exact figure is still argued, but the scale is not. Dozens of senior officers killed, the commanders of the cavalry and the infantry, dead, Valens himself, dead somewhere in the wreck of his own line, his body never found. Rome had lost battles before. It lost 50,000 men in an afternoon at Cannae nearly 6 centuries earlier, and recovered so completely that it won the war. Within months of Cannae, the Republic was enrolling slaves and lowering the property qualification to fill new legions, and it refused even to ransom its own captured soldiers because the system that produced armies was intact and everyone knew it could simply produce more. But Cannae happened to a system that could absorb it. Adrianople revealed the system was gone. So here is the real question, and it is not how the Goths beat the Romans. It is how the most flexible heavy infantry machine in the ancient world, an institution built specifically to survive bad generals and bad days, became an army that could be caught mid-column, packed so tightly that men could not raise their sword arms, and butchered standing up. Because the Goths did not do that to Rome. Rome did it to itself, over roughly a century and a half, one administrative decision at a time. Adrianople was only the invoice. Here is what this episode will walk through. First, the 8 hours before the first javelin was thrown, hour by hour, because this army was defeated by its own march before the enemy touched it. Second, how the original manipular legion actually worked, the checkerboard of small units and line relief, because you cannot see what failed until you see the machine intact. Third, the frontier soldiers called the limitanei, the men Rome downgraded on paper, and what that single piece of accounting cost the empire from Hadrian's Wall to Egypt to the reign of Justinian. Fourth, the habit that quietly vanished from the Roman army, the fortified camp, dug fresh every night on campaign, including one cut into a hillside in northeastern Scotland that still marks the ground today. And fifth, the 5 specific institutional failures in order that turned armored heavy infantry from Rome's decisive weapon into its most expensive way to die. There is also one more thread. The ancient writer whose single famous sentence about soldiers abandoning their armor shaped how Europe understood this story for more than 1,000 years was wrong, and he was wrong in a way that is more uncomfortable than the story he told. I will come back to him near the end. A note on method before we begin. Nothing here is narrated from memory alone. The spine of the ancient account is Ammianus Marcellinus, a former staff officer who had served in the Eastern Army himself and who wrote up the disaster within about a decade of it, close enough that survivors could still contradict him. On top of that sits modern scholarship, including a 2019 chapter on the disaster at Adrianople and the study Failure of Empire, and a 2023 examination of the Roman High Command at that battle, where the numbers are contested, I will say so plainly. Start with the man at the center of the column. Valens was not a fool, whatever the later chroniclers wanted him to be. He had ruled the East since 364, when his brother Valentinian raised him to the purple. He had campaigned on the Danube before, and he had fought these same Goths to a negotiated peace in 369, meeting their leader on a boat in the middle of the river because neither side would set foot on the other's bank. His problem in the summer of 378 was not stupidity. It was that every institution around him was feeding him pressure instead of information. 2 years before the battle, in 376, a mass of Gothic refugees had arrived on the north bank of the Danube, driven off the steppe by the Huns and asking for admission into the empire. The numbers in the sources run into the tens of thousands, possibly 100,000 people counting families, though every ancient figure deserves suspicion. Rome let them cross because Valens saw in them a recruiting pool and a tax base. Then the Roman officials on the ground, and Ammianus names them, the commanders Lupicinus and Maximus, starved them, extorted them, and in at least one recorded episode sold them dog meat at the price of their own children sold into slavery, 1 child per dog. When Lupicinus then tried to solve the problem he had created by murdering the Gothic leadership at a banquet in Adrianople, he missed the man who mattered, a chieftain named Fritigern, who walked out of that city and raised the whole Danube frontier. The Goths rose. For 2 years they moved through Thrace, and the Eastern Field Army maneuvered against them with partial success and partial disaster until Valens himself came west from the Persian frontier to finish it. Now trace the 9th of August itself. The army leaves its fortified base outside Adrianople in the early morning, leaving the baggage, the treasury, and the imperial regalia behind the walls. The intelligence estimate says 10,000 Goths. It is wrong, and it is wrong in the worst possible way, because it counts only the warriors present at the wagon circle and misses the entire Gothic cavalry, under the chieftains Elatheus and Saphrax, which is away foraging, and the pressure on Valens to act on that number is coming from 2 directions at once. His general Sebastianus has just cut up a Gothic raiding column with a picked force of 2,000 men, and a faction at court is telling the emperor the enemy is beaten in detail and ripe. Meanwhile, Gratian, 19 years old, has just won his own victory over the Alemanni at Argentaria in the west, and his letters urging his uncle to wait for him read, to a proud man of 50, less like counsel than like a young rival asking for half the credit. The march runs 8 hours through heat and smoke because Fritigern has fired the fields, a deliberate move to cook the Romans inside their armor before a blow is struck. The men arrive in the early afternoon dehydrated, hungry, and still deploying from column into line when everything begins. And here is the detail that the 2019 chapter in Failure of Empire dwells on because it matters. There was still a negotiation happening. Gothic envoys were going back and forth, and Fritigern, who had no interest in gambling his whole people on one afternoon, was asking for hostages of rank to guarantee a parley. The senior Western officer Richomeres actually volunteered himself and was walking toward the Gothic wagons. Valens was, plausibly, hours from getting most of what he wanted without a battle. Then 2 Roman units on the right, the archers and shield-bearing skirmishers under the officers Bacurius and Cassio, launched an unauthorized attack and were thrown back in disorder. At almost the same moment, the Gothic cavalry returned from foraging and, in Ammianus's phrase, came down like a thunderbolt off the high ground into the Roman right wing. What follows is not a battle in the sense the manipular legion would have understood. The Roman cavalry breaks and rides off the field. The Gothic horsemen wheel into the exposed flank of the Roman infantry, and the infantry from the wagon circle pushes out into their front. The Roman line, still half-formed, is compressed from 2 sides at once. And this is the moment the whole episode turns on. The heavy infantry of the East, armored, professional, the direct institutional descendants of the men who broke Hannibal and Mithridates in the Gauls, are squeezed into a mass so dense that the sources describe men unable to draw swords, unable to lift shields, dying on their feet with no room to fall. Ammianus says the dust rose so thick that men could not see the missiles coming, and that the field was so choked with bodies the living stumbled on the dead as they tried to give ground that did not exist. The armor that had made them lords of the battlefield now simply slowed the process of killing them. It took until nightfall. Somewhere in that press, Valens died. One tradition says he was carried wounded to a farmhouse that the Goths, not knowing who was inside, burned when the defenders on the upper floor would not surrender, and that a single soldier escaped through a window to tell the story. Another says simply an arrow and the press and the dark. His body was never recovered. A detail the reference literature on his reign records without embellishment, because there is nothing to embellish. An emperor of Rome went into a field, and the empire never found him again. With him died the master of cavalry Trajan, the general Sebastianus, and by Ammianus's count 35 tribunes, the commanders of individual regiments, an entire generation of the Eastern officer corps in one evening. Now, the reason I have walked you through this hour by hour is not that Adrianople was exceptional, it is the opposite. the false economy on intelligence, the political race against a co-emperor, the willingness to fight unfed and unwatered at a time chosen by the enemy, the line with no articulation and no reserve behavior once it was compressed. None of that was an aberration in 378. All of it was standard practice. The battle did not break the rules of the late Roman army, it followed them. To see why that is the damning part, you have to look at the machine as it was originally built. The classic Republican legion was not a block of men, it was a checkerboard. A 2020 article in the journal Historia on the evolution of the manipular legion in the early Republic, and an earlier study from 2010 on the legion's earliest constitution both trace the same core idea at some point in its early wars, probably against the Samnites in the broken hill country of central Italy where a solid phalanx could not keep its footing. Rome deliberately broke its heavy infantry into small semi-independent handfuls of men called maniples of men, arranged in 3 successive lines with gaps between the units. Put numbers on it. A maniple of the first 2 lines was about 120 men, of the third line about 60, each under 2 centurions, and a legion fielded 30 of these blocks arranged in a pattern later writers compared to the 5 spots on dice. The first line, the hastati, were the youngest men. Behind them stood the principes, men in their prime. Behind them the triarii, the oldest veterans, kneeling behind their shields with thrusting spears. Think about what that structure actually does. The first line fights. When it tires or fails, it does not rout, because there is a second line of fresh men standing in ordered gaps directly behind it, and the spent troops can filter backward through those gaps while the next line steps forward. Behind them stands a third line of veterans. The final answer, the origin of the Roman proverb about a fight going all the way to the triarii. The legion could feed fresh men into a melee the way a machine feeds fuel. It could bend around terrain, it could lose a line, and still be an army. Even the weapons served the system. The pilum, the heavy javelin each man threw before contact, was built with a soft iron shank behind the point, so that when it struck a shield it bent, and the enemy either fought with a 7-foot pole dragging from his shield or threw the shield away. The equipment was designed to create the disordered enemy that the rotating lines were designed to grind down. And that flexibility did not live in the equipment. It lived in 3 institutions. It lived in drill, endless, standardized, brutal drill, so that rotating thousands of exhausted men through gaps under attack was a rehearsed motion and not a prayer. It lived in a deep bench of junior officers, the centurions, roughly 60 to a legion, promoted from the ranks for steadiness rather than dash, each one carrying the system in his head, which is why the death of a general did not decapitate a Republican legion. The knowledge was distributed too low to kill in one blow. And it lived in habits of campaign discipline so ingrained they look almost obsessive to us, of which the most famous is the camp, and we will come to the camp. Between the 3rd and 4th centuries, under the pressure of civil wars and simultaneous frontier crises, the empire rebuilt its army into something structurally different. The reorganization is associated above all with Diocletian and then Constantine, and you can read its end state in a surviving late Roman government document, the Notitia Dignitatum, essentially the empire's military org chart. Units shrank from the old legion of 5,000 or so down to regiments of perhaps 1,000 men, sometimes fewer. The army split into 2 legally distinct tiers, mobile field forces, the comitatenses held near the emperors, and static frontier troops, the limitanei, strung along the borders on lower pay and lower status. The distinction was written directly into law. Surviving legislation from the 360s grade soldiers' privileges, their tax exemptions, even their discharge benefits, by tier. The change was rational on paper. Emperors who had spent a century being murdered by frontier armies, and the 3rd century crisis produced dozens of claimants raised on the shields of border legions, wanted the best troops' clothes and the borders held cheaply. But institutions are not paper. Grade a soldier a second class for 3 generations and you get a second-class soldier, not because the man is worse, but because everything that made him excellent, the training cadre, the veteran officers, the expectation of maneuver has been priced out of his unit. And I want to be careful here because the old story, the one about soft, cowardly late Romans, does not survive contact with the evidence. A 2014 study of the morale of the late Roman army pushes back hard on that caricature. These men still fought, still died in place, still held frontiers for lifetimes. At Adrianople itself, 2 regiments, the Lanciarii and the Mattiarii, stood their ground around the emperor while the army disintegrated around them and stood until they were destroyed. The rot was not in their courage, it was in the system wrapped around their courage. At Adrianople, when the line compressed, there was no drilled mechanism for relief, no checkerboard to breathe through, no institutional answer at all. Brave men in armor standing in a crowd is not a tactical system, it is a target. You can watch this institutional slide happen in 3 different places at 3 different speeds, and it is worth doing because each one shows a different face of the same failure. Start at the empire's northwestern edge. A 2012 study of Hadrian's Wall at the end of Roman rule examines the limitanei of the northern British frontier, the units strung along the wall's line in the 4th century. These garrisons had, in some cases, held the same forts for 200 years, and Constantine had made military service legally hereditary, so fathers were succeeded by sons as a matter of statute, not just habit. Units recruited from the villages that had grown up against their own walls. The archaeology says the same thing the documents do. At the fort of Bertuswald, excavation shows the great granaries, the infrastructure of a supplied imperial army, going out of use in the late 4th century and being replaced on the same footprint by timber halls, the architecture of a local chieftain and his warband. They were, by the end, less a deployable army than a hereditary local institution, embedded in the landscape, paid irregularly, and increasingly indistinguishable from the frontier society they guarded. When the imperial pay system finally failed in Britain in the early 5th century, these units did not march away. There was nowhere to march to. The army did not leave Britain so much as dissolve into it. Now go to the opposite corner of the Roman world. A study of the Roman army in 4th century Egypt shows the other face of the problem. Egypt was rich, essential, and mostly quiet, and the army stationed there reflects it. Units appear dispersed in small detachments across towns and river stations, escorting grain, backing up tax collectors, policing disputes, garrisoning rather than campaigning. We can see this life at ground level because the desert preserved paperwork. The archive of one Flavius Avienus, a cavalry commander at the fort of Dionysius in the Fayum in the 340s, survives on papyrus. And what does the commander of a Roman cavalry unit spend his days on? Petitions about stolen pigs, sheep rustling, requests to excuse a villager's son from the draft, a dispute over fleeces. Each detachment made administrative sense. But an army that spends generations broken into fragments doing constabulary work is an army in name and on payroll only. You cannot summon a field force out of a filing system. When the 4th century emperors needed mass, trained, articulated heavy infantry for battles like Adrianople, this was the reservoir they were nominally drawing on. And then look forward, because the most damning evidence is that Adrianople changed almost none of this. 150 years later, in the 6th century, the historian Procopius was describing the frontier soldiers of Justinian's empire, and a 2021 study of Procopius on soldiers and military institutions examines what he says about the limitanei of that era, soldiers whose very status as soldiers was in question, whose pay could be withheld or written off, who existed in a gray zone between garrison, militia, and pensioner. Procopius claims, in his secret history, that Justinian at one point simply canceled years of the frontier troops' pay arrears outright, on the reasoning that men who did not campaign were not really soldiers, and Procopius is a hostile witness, but the legal record of the period shows the same drift he describes. The empire had watched its 2-tier army fail catastrophically in 378, and its answer over the following century and a half was to lean into the tier system harder. Institutions do not learn just because they bleed. So let us name the failures precisely, 5 of them in order of how deep they cut. Failure 1, the death of the training pipeline. The Republican and early Imperial Legion was, above everything, a school. Recruits were hammered through standardized drill by veteran instructors until formation changes were reflex. And we know the curriculum because a Roman writer named Vegetius preserved it, the military step, 20 Roman miles in 5 summer hours under full load. The practice post, struck twice a day with wicker shields and wooden swords deliberately made double weight so that the real weapons felt light, swimming, entrenching, vaulting, formation drills repeated monthly for veterans, not just recruits. By the late 4th century, that pipeline had thinned to the point that Vegetius sat down and wrote an entire treatise, the Re Militari, that is essentially a plea. Here is the old training system. Here is what we no longer do. Restore it, and you restore the army. Hold on to Vegetius, because he returns at the end of this episode. The point for now is simple. Armor can be manufactured in a season. A veteran drill cadre takes a generation to build and one budget cycle to destroy, and once it is gone, the men wearing the armor are heavy infantry in costume. Failure 2. The collapse of campaign discipline, and its symbol is a ditch in Scotland. At a place called Deer's Den, near Kintore in Aberdeenshire, archaeologists have excavated a Roman marching camp, published in the Roman Frontier Studies series, one of a chain of temporary fortifications cut into hostile country far beyond any permanent frontier, and the excavation there turned up more than 100 field bread ovens, the breakfast of an army that slept behind its own rampart and ate before it marched. Understand what that object means. At the end of a full day's march, in enemy territory, every Roman soldier dropped his pack and dug. The Greek historian Polybius, writing in the 2nd century before Christ, describes the system with astonishment. An identical internal layout every night, the same streets, the same position for every tent and every unit, so that an army arriving exhausted in the dark could fortify and billet itself like a town being unfolded from a box, and any soldier could find any unit blindfolded. A ditch, a rampart, a standardized grid, every single night and abandoned the next morning. That habit bought the army secure sleep, protected supplies, and, above all, choice: fight today or refuse, fight here or elsewhere, on our timing or not at all. Hannibal spent 15 years in Italy and could almost never force a Roman army to fight on a day it declined, because the army could always shut its gates. Now set that against the 9th of August, 378, and an army that marched 8 waterless hours away from its fortifications to fight, unfed and unformed at the hour its enemy preferred. The spade had been the legion's second weapon. The institution that swung it had rusted through. Failure 3. The two-tier army. The legal split between field troops and frontier troops solved a political problem, keeping the best soldiers under the emperor's hand, and created a military one that never stopped growing. The frontier tier, as we saw in Britain and Egypt, sank slowly from soldiers into settled garrisons, which meant every serious war had to be fought by the mobile field armies alone, and there were never enough of them. And when one was destroyed, as at Adrianople, there was no deep bench of frontier-hardened units to promote into the gap. The Republic could lose an army and raise another from the same system. The late Empire lost an army and lost the system with it. And here is the second-order consequence, the one that outlived everyone on that field. Because the Eastern army could not be rebuilt from within, the new Emperor Theodosius settled with the Goths in 382, on terms no earlier emperor would have signed. They would live inside the empire, on Roman land, serving under their own chieftains as allied contingents, rather than as recruits dissolved into Roman units. The empire did not just lose soldiers at Adrianople. It lost the ability to make soldiers, and started renting them instead, and among the children raised inside that arrangement was a Goth named Alaric, who in 410 would lead his people through the gates of Rome itself. Failure 4. The politicization of the High Command. The 2023 study of the Roman High Command at Adrianople, part of a larger work on the field armies of the East Roman Empire, reconstructs who was actually making decisions outside that city, and the picture is a court, not a staff. Senior commands held by courtiers and rivals, councils split between men urging attack, Sebastianus riding his recent success, and men urging delay, chiefly the veteran cavalry commander Victor, a Sarmatian by birth and by every account the most cautious head in the room, and above them an emperor whose incentives were dynastic, beat Gratian to the glory as much as military. Ammianus even preserves the tone of the flatterers around Valens, urging haste, so the nephew's fresh laurels would not overshadow the uncle's. The old legion had been designed to survive exactly this, because tactical competence lived low in its centurions and its drills. The Republic routinely handed armies to amateur politicians on one-year terms and won anyway, because the machine under them knew its business. The late army had inverted the pyramid. Judgment pooled at the top, in the one place Roman politics guaranteed it would be compromised. Failure 5. The loss of tactical articulation. This is the one that killed men in the last hours at Adrianople. The checkerboard was gone. Late Roman infantry fought in fewer, denser lines, and dense lines can be superb, right up until something goes wrong on a flank. 21 years earlier, at Strasbourg in 357, a late Roman line under Julian had been dented by an Alemannic charge and had held, because that day it had a formed reserve and a general close enough to commit it, and 13,000 Romans broke 35,000 Alemanni, so the late system could work when everything went right. The manipular system's entire genius was that it did not need everything to go right, because it had a rehearsed answer for things going wrong: gaps, relief, rotation, a third line. The army at Adrianople, compressed by cavalry on one side and the wagon fighters on the other, had no gaps to breathe through and no drilled motion for creating them. Heavy armor inside a functioning system is dominance. Heavy armor inside a static crowd is a sentence, and on that evening it was carried out until dark. Which brings us back to the promise from the opening, the man who got the diagnosis wrong. Vegetius, writing within living memory of Adrianople, gave later ages their explanation for the disaster in one unforgettable claim, that the infantry had grown lazy and abandoned their armor and helmets, and so were cut down by barbarian arrows. It is a perfect sentence. It is vivid, it is moralizing, and a 2011 study of the transmission and printing of De Re Militari shows how far it traveled. It survives in well over 200 medieval manuscripts, more than almost any secular text from antiquity. It was among the first military books ever printed, appearing within about 2 decades of Gutenberg, and it was read by commanders for 1,000 years, carried on campaign, excerpted into knightly handbooks, as the authoritative account of why Rome's infantry fell. And yet the men at Adrianople did not die because they lacked armor. They died wearing it, packed so close it could not help them. Many modern historians doubt Roman infantry ever shed their armor on anything like the scale Vegetius described. The artistic and archaeological record shows helmets and mail in production and used straight through the period. His error is the instructive part. He looked at a dying institution and blamed the equipment and the individual soldier, because equipment and soldiers are visible and institutions are not. You can see a missing helmet. You cannot see a missing generation of centurions, a training pipeline that quietly stopped flowing, a camp that no longer gets dug. The most read military writer of the ancient world stood inside an institutional collapse and could not name it. Most people standing inside one never can. So hold the two images side by side one last time. A temporary camp at Deer's Den, ditch and rampart cut by tired men in hostile country at the end of a marching day, because the system demanded it and the system was obeyed. And a plain north of Adrianople, where the heirs of that system stood in their armor in a crowd with no water, no formation, no relief, and no emperor by nightfall. Same empire, same armor. The difference was everything you cannot dig out of the ground. The Goths won the battle, but the verdict had been written over the previous century by pay grades, court appointments, and abandoned drills, and on the 9th of August, 378, it was simply read aloud. In the next episode, the same question runs in reverse, not how an institution rotted, but how a single piece of engineering, a new style of fortress wall out of Italy, made every castle in Europe obsolete within a generation and forced the armies of an entire continent to relearn war from the ground up. If this one earned it, a like genuinely helps the channel, and if you want the next file when it opens, subscribe. I will see you in the war room.